We must learn to leave some things alone.
On the 13th of September 1999, Earth's moon is blown out of Earth's orbit. Commander Koenig and Dr. Russell lead the survivors of Moonbase Alpha as it wanders aimlessly through the universe, in a series that sometimes seems like it's wandering aimlessly through the universe. Space 1999.
Those other worlds out there that depended on that brain. Think what they've lost.
A spacefaring series that's totally not influenced by Star Trek, which follows the adventures of the men and women of Moonbase Alpha, where they will find unusual and previously unencountered planets, search for unfamiliar beings and societies, and audaciously travel to a place that no person has previously visited. Space 1999 was a big-budget mid-70s science fiction series made in Britain.
On a barren rock flying endlessly through space.
With an eye on sales to a US network. The show had made a reasonably big splash at the time, where it was one of the few big-budget science fiction space-set shows made before Star Wars.
I think we're going to be all right.
Space 1999 ran for 2 seasons between 1975 and 77, though as we'll see, both seasons are quite different from each other in their look, their feel, their tone, and substance, or lack thereof. So there's Space 1999 Year 1 and Year 2. Year 1 is the relatively serious sci-fi rival to Star Trek, full of mystery and wonder and the ambiguously unexplained, while Year 2 is more kid-friendly, an action series with lots of aliens and monsters with very definite explanations of the plot. There are fans who enjoy the whole series, though chances are you have a preference for one version over the other. As in, do you want to listen to Queen's version of Bohemian Rhapsody, or do you want to listen to the version put out by Bad News?
Oh no! What have I been doing?
Also, the show was forever known to me and my family as Space 1999. The number of 9s was not important, so sometimes I'd just keep going until I needed to take a breath, or having failed to have done so in time, passing out.
And when it started, it was to prove terrifying.
I recently had to split a bill that worked out to $199.09. I call that a rounding error.
Human error blasted this moon out of the Earth's orbit.
In the year 1999, preparations are being made for a manned mission to the planet Meta, from which a signal is being received that could indicate life. On Earth's moon, John Koenig returns to Moonbase Alpha as its new commander, where he has orders to get the troubled manned mission to Meta back on track. Koenig has discovered that the Meta mission, to use a technical term, is royally stuffed, with astronauts becoming incredibly ill and dying at a rate that would make bubonic plague envious. The problem is traced to a buildup of energy at one of the moon's nuclear waste dumps. Before things get too far, the largest waste dump explodes with such force that it breaks the moon out of Earth's orbit, sending it hurtling through space on a seemingly random trajectory, like a tour bus without a guide or a driver or a steering wheel or a working park brake. The rest of the series is about the surviving 300 crew members of Moonbase Alpha, where they encounter various planets and beings, and a lot of strange phenomena along the way. All the while with the overriding thought that maybe they might find somewhere to settle. Anywhere's good, just so long as it's got good Wi-Fi and that there's no chance of random moons crashing into your new condo on Earth too. They will meet aliens, both friendly and not so friendly, and encounter random people from Earth who, for whatever reason, cannot link up with the Moonbase Alpha crew. The Alphans will encounter a plethora of strange phenomena, manifesting itself as glowing globs of blue light, or glowing globs of yellow light, or glowing globs of white light, though sometimes it's glowing globs of green light. Some unexplained, mysterious alien influence will do something really weird or strange or horrible that the Alphans are in fact powerless to affect. And then just as quickly, everything will be back to normal with little input required from the crew.
Something brought us home.
Easy explanations are not what the show was about in its first year.
It's possible.
Though at times it can feel like you're watching characters who are reacting to a situation, but can often do little other than try not to get killed. While something unusual happens and then fingers crossed everything will be fine at the end.
It's a miracle we're alive, John.
Space 1999 has a number of obvious influences. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Forbidden Planet, and of course, Star Trek. To a casual observer, writing off Space 1999 as a Star Trek ripoff does come off as the hottest of hot takes. Beyond the superficial similarities, a crew having space adventures, Space 1999 does feel fairly different to Trek, even after a former producer of Star Trek took over the running of the show. Space 1999 also takes cues from other series made by its creators, Gerry and Sylvia Anderson. They'd previously had success in the 1960s making popular kids' action series starring marionettes. They'd moved to live-action productions with the creepy sci-fi series UFO, which in many ways would influence its eventual successor.
Doesn't matter what it is or where it came from. The important thing is that it is here.
Space 1999, as a live-action production from the producers of Thunderbirds, would often attract criticism for the acting, which was mostly unwarranted, with reviewers at the time of the show's release congratulating themselves for being the very first person ever to comment on the cast of Space 1999 coming off as wooden as the puppets that had starred in the Andersons' earlier series.
I am from the planet Earth.
That's possibly an unkind segue into looking at the main characters of the series. It's unkind, it's unwarranted, but at times it's perhaps unavoidable.
There's nothing we can do about it.
The success or otherwise of Space 1999 would rest on the shoulders of its leads, American stars Martin Landau and Barbara Bain, with strong support from the series' other regulars.
To be particularly susceptible to psychic phenomenon and sometimes...
A good cast was also necessary in such an expensive series where so many top names were hired as guest stars in the show's first year. It is apparent that the serious way the show was presented means that the cast don't often radiate a lot of warmth and charm, and there is precious little humour. That would be something that would change drastically in the show's second year.
Oh, listen, we're talking about John Koenig. Do you remember him, John Koenig?
Commander John Koenig was a stoic leader who didn't smile much, until they had him smiling way too much.
Oh, yeah.
Koenig balanced logic and instinct in his command decisions, where he could make informed judgments in many life and death situations. Apart from the times his crew didn't agree and tried to mutiny, Koenig could be softly spoken in one scene and then overwrought, shouting and seemingly on the edge of a nervous breakdown in the next. Koenig was a problem solver, taking advice from his staff before making the final call.
The only chance you have is to help each other and live together.
Landau will move between playing the stoic but considerate leader and somebody barely hanging on, somebody who could show his temper. And it was rare for a leader of a series like this to be shown as vulnerable to the level that Koenig often was. It is easy to think of them as blocks of wood in the first season, mainly because they are restrained in normal circumstances, but become more animated when the situation calls for it. That's called acting, dear boy. What they're not doing, hamming it up like a certain Starfleet captain. John Koenig is not Jim Kirk. Helena is not Dr. McCoy, and there is no one to pop a Spock on it. Well, not just yet.
If you're gonna die, you might as well die on Alpha.
Dr. Helena Russell was the Chief Medical Officer of Moonbase Alpha, icy in her attention to detail in medical matters, but wasn't completely closed off emotionally. Helena would be the voice of caution on Alpha, raising concerns for the safety and welfare of the crew. Well, those that don't get taken over by aliens or crash in an eagle or suddenly disappear without trace in between seasons. Bain, on the other hand, plays Helena as reserved most of the time in the first year, but will allow her character to show vulnerabilities more convincingly. Koenig and Dr. Russell are occasionally paired up together in some first season episodes, but in the retooled second year of the series, their relationship has solidified to the point where the pair are quite definitely together. Martin Landau and Barbara Bain were married for decades and had previously both starred in the first 3 seasons of Mission Impossible, for which Bain had won several Emmy Awards.
Good morning, Miss Carter.
Landau knew as the series star that he could shape the series into something that suited him, as in, he had his preferred profile. If anyone on Alpha was to save the day, it would be him. Other male actors would have to walk behind him. Bain would also have her own wishes, like wishing to be made up looking pale compared to Landau, who wanted his character to have a deep tan, despite the problems this would cause for lighting. Bain would also have input on how supporting roles were used, notably for female characters, with certain caveats on how Catherine Schell's character in Year 2 could be used.
I'm sorry I chewed your head off.
Well, you're doing it in a very nice way.
Despite the stars' tendency to be stars, waving around their big comlocks, their co-stars would generally speak reasonably well about the series' leads, in sharp contrast to another major space series which we won't name, but it's an anagram of cart rest. For the second season, Helena Russell gained responsibility for the base's life support systems, which would have her in Control Center more often, where she could play a larger role in the plots. While there had been occasional narrations in some Year 1 episodes, many second season episodes began with Helena recording a status update, which was in no way some form of log entry. With the general lightening of the series' atmosphere, Helena seems much more lively in Year 2. In Year 1, Helena often spoke in a whisper, while in Year 2, both Martin Landau and Barbara Bain seemed like they had both discovered happy hour, where their characters would joke around, show affection for each other on screen, and off-screen challenge stagehands to arm wrestling contests.
Why should they have all the fun?
Apparently, on the moon, it's always time for a nooner.
Are we going to have any off-duty time that coincides?
Professor Victor Bergman was Alpha's scientific advisor during the show's first year.
And what caused it?
That's a good question.
Though in the spirit of things, he's really the guest master general with his stabs at explaining an unusual phenomenon. With the crew of Moonbase Alpha encountering so many phenomena outside of human experience, Victor is often reduced to suppositions, speculation, and a fair bit of plucking out of thin air.
I have no idea.
And when a rational explanation eludes him, he'll just shrug and then paper over knowledge gaps with philosophy.
Not entirely, but...
Victor has an artificial heart that can slow him down at times. And also, he couldn't be stuffed getting a haircut throughout his time on Alpha. Possibly because he had beef with Moonbase Alpha's barber, Bertram.
Oh, I don't know exactly. I'm a scientist, I don't know.
Bergman can be a contradictory character at times. Sometimes he gets quite wrapped up in science, and at other times he's more of a humanist, where he really loves to get into the weeds with metaphysical matters. Barry Morse was a prolific British actor who later moved to Canada. In the 1960s, he famously played Inspector Gerard in the American series The Fugitive. Morse had previously appeared in a series made by ITC, and would become an anchor for much of the first year of Space 1999.
My guess is that it's not really a rock at all.
Victor, of course, just didn't have all the answers, and would often have to just speculate on what it was they were dealing with. And when that didn't work, he'd start waffling about something.
The gods using us for their sport, perhaps.
My mechanic is a bit like that. When he can't work out why the check engine light keeps going on, he starts talking about the intrinsic unknowability of the human experience, just before he presents me with a bill for parts, for labour, and a service fee added for giving me something to think about.
We have learned many things, but most of all, that we still have much to learn.
Of all the actors not billed in the opening titles, Nick Tate as Alan Carter proved to be one of the few people on Moonbase Alpha to have a distinct personality beyond their job description.
How can you be such a dumb blind kangaroo?
Alan is headstrong and brash, prone to acting without thinking, which is obviously a total and utter stretch for an Australian cast in that role.
Well, in my book cover, your kind of help is mutiny.
Nick Tate initially auditioned for an Italian character, though thankfully he was allowed to speak in something close to his own accent, though it's still somewhat exaggerated, just so people know he's Australian.
Can you kill me, copper?
Thankfully though, he's not reduced to having to pretend that he drinks Fosters in order to satisfy Helena's weirdo post-Crocodile Dundee down under fetish. Also, truth be told, it's kinda cool seeing an Ozstronaut.
Okay, now this is the big one. This is the big one. This is the try line. You ready?
Nick Tate was basically the only character to return for Year 2 without having the role significantly watered down. Instead, Tate's role was often much larger than before. Most of the rest of the regular characters are less developed. They're more people who fill in specific story roles for episodes. A second-in-command who will sometimes argue with the boss, a woman who clearly has low blood sugar, dude who knows where all 39 Windows 98 floppy disks are stored, a doctor to do medical stuff when Helena's not around. Prentis Hancock appeared in most Year 1 episodes as Paul Morrow, Alpha's second-in-command, who more or less handles the daily operational matters. He's usually fairly controlled in stress situations where he'll generally try to keep things running smoothly. Paul Morrow had a mustache, but it wasn't because he had appeared in adult films when he was at university. Fairly certain he was clean-shaven at the time.
We're all going to die in a minute.
David Kano was Alpha's computer expert, who at one point was part of an experiment linking the human brain to a computer. Of all the Alphans, Kano has the most faith in computers, but he at no point ever fixes it by switching it off and on again. The worst part of his job is having to clean out the gunk from the mice.
It's just 2 hours before we have to abandon phase 2.
Thought you said we had an emergency.
Did I, sir? Must have been mistaken.
Being the IT guy, he gets the fancy swivel desk in Main Mission, though Paul Morrow tries awfully hard to conceal his envy. Sandra Benish was a general operative in Main Mission, the sometimes girlfriend of Paul Morrow and whoever else they needed her to be engaged to for an episode. Sandra provided a vital role when they needed somebody to faint, or to be injured or captured. Basically somebody to sell the scariness of a situation, or to read out loud any text off a monitor or a computer readout.
David has double-checked them with the computer, and the fact is we are going to collide with that planet in less than 7 hours.
Dr. Bob Mathias was Helena's backup in medical centre, somebody useful for Helena to bounce ideas off of in medical matters. In Main Mission there was also Tanya, and in about 45 different roles, Shane Rimmer.
You must not touch my brain!
Some or many or actually most of these characters will disappear between seasons, but we'll talk more about the cast changes for Year 2 a little later on. In its first year, Stories of Space 1999 often had a serious tone, with little outright comedy and only a few jokes. They went for poetry over potty humour.
It's a long shot.
With so many aliens visiting Alpha, many episodes, in fact, too many episodes, would end up with somebody staring out of a window at the stars with a wondrous look on their face. Or a confused look on their face.
It's very strange.
Just a lot of pondering. Space 1999 landed right in the middle of the 70s, at a time when hard science would often have to coexist with more supernatural ideas. It was still a science fiction show all of the time, but also skirted with examining the human conditions in several episodes. It allowed its characters to disagree, even bicker with each other at times.
Then we'll die for certain.
There were horror episodes that were more thoughtful, episodes with a serious dilemma. There were episodes where viewers would turn to each other and say, "What the hell is going on?"
Wasn't a bad trip.
And peppered throughout all, action scenes with stunt performers doing leaps, being knocked across the set, or being sucked out into space. It's this varied mix in the first year that makes the show so unique. Another constant throughout the first season, the Alphans are desperate to find a new home, where any number of potentially habitable planets they pass might trigger Alpha's evacuation protocol known as Operation Exodus.
Statistically, that means about 10 Earth-type planets for every one in Alpha.
Space 1999 was set in, hang on, just let me check the calendar.
Try to remember.
Oh right, 1999. But its pre-production design work was mainly carried out during 1973. So the series has an early to mid-70s idea of what the late 1990s would look like. Unfortunately, it's a future where flared trousers never went out of style.
But why would such a civilized people punish a man in such a diabolical way?
Moonbase Alpha has a distinctive look courtesy of production designer Keith Wilson. He'd been working on designs for Alpha ever since the show was conceived of as a UFO spin-off. Wilson would play a big part in the visual success of Space 1999. Moonbase Alpha sets were built with modularity in mind, meaning sets could quickly be repurposed from, say, medical center to somebody's quarters to a new lab. It's the early to mid-70s, when bright colors were on their way out and muted earth tones were in. And boy, were they in. Moonbase Alpha is so muted that you'd have little problem watching the series in black and white. Practically the only colour about the place was that one colour sleeve on the uniforms designed by American designer Rudy Gernrich. These costumes with their beige shoes, beige flares, beige tops with a flash of colour on a sleeve topped by the largest zipper made on planet Earth were certainly unique. They were obviously thought of as the height of fashion when designed around 1973. The uniforms were almost one size fits none, flattering few of the cast since they never seemed to fit all that right. They would be retooled between seasons, where they would still be of their time, only slightly less of a fashion crime. I mean, stick somebody in beige flares and a beige pullover and you'll immediately think of Space 1999. Nobody else can really pull off the one coloured sleeve without coming off as second best in any comparison, though some dared to dream. The flared trousers may date the series the most, but they are practical in that they assist with keeping air flowing throughout Moonbase Alpha. Moonbase Alpha was so large that you would have to use the underground train known as a travel tube to quickly get from one part of the base to another. Or if you wanted to be cynical, editors could use the travel tube stock footage to cut from one scene to another. Alphan personnel each had a coded comlock, which was part communicator, part keycard. If it looks oddly bulky, it's likely down to the prop being designed around accommodating the smallest picture tube available at the time. The screens on Alpha were a mix of real black and white television monitors, endlessly calibrated so that they would sync with the film cameras, and colour screens which were often burned in during post-production. The other common item was the stun gun, which had multiple settings, at least one of which does what it says on the tin. There are also larger rifles and various scientific devices and scanners, but the comlock and the stun gun are two things immediately associated with the series. One of Space 1999's most enduring and endearing additions to the canon of science fiction was the Eagle spacecraft designed by Brian Johnson. The Eagles are all-purpose space vessels capable of having different modules fitted for different purposes. They could be outfitted for transporting cargo, medical duties, combat, or whatever. They're designed for use mainly in space, so they don't have to worry about aerodynamics and the like.
4 of our Eagles are damaged. We're defenseless.
Their spaceworthiness has to come into question when you tote up the number of crashes, both fatal and otherwise, that we will see during the course of the series. I mean, just how many of these damn things do they have?
We found Eagle 1.
Such was their impact, no pun intended, that after seeing them on Space 1999, George Lucas insisted that the initial designs of the Millennium Falcon in Star Wars be changed after he saw similarities with the Eagles. Brian Johnson and Nick Alder oversaw the special effects in Space 1999, which included a very large amount of miniature work carried out at Bray Studios. Most of the effects were achieved in camera, with some opticals added for things like beams and energy fields. Some scenes with multiple vehicles would be achieved with double exposures. At other times, photographic cutouts were used. At times, some of the superimposed effects were achieved quite simply by reflecting light shapes or images onto a sheet of glass in front of the camera lens. And a popular gag in the second season was to simply stick actors behind a set to simulate a view screen.
It's a holographic recording.
A less effective in-camera solution was to simulate a force field by using coloured sheets of perspex on the set.
Terrible effect.
The Alphans have moon buggies that can also be remote controlled, and later on there are defensive laser cannons. So, if you had a bit too much to drink and you had the graveyard shift in main mission, you could always while away the early hours by taking pot shots at remote control buggies. However, please make sure it's an unmanned moon buggy before firing, though in hindsight that may actually explain Paul's disappearance. There are many other ships in Space 1999. There are Swifts and Hawks, and then there are all the vessels designed by non-avian obsessed ship designers. All are filmed beautifully, with only a very few effects shots not coming off as well as intended.
Lambda waves.
The 70s saw a few British television series delve into space, though few had effects that approached the levels of Space 1999's miniatures.
They can bend space, even time. Turn both inside out.
Space 1999 was initially to be shot at studios in Elstree, but with the possibility of that studio not being available for the entirety of Space 1999's 15-month shoot, production moved to nearby Pinewood Studios. The show may have been called 1999, but it was not a cheap show to make. But it also was not something dashed out quickly. The series began with the idea of a 9-day shooting schedule, but the vast majority of episodes would take between 11 and 14 days to shoot, with a few episodes taking less time and a few running much longer. In contrast, many American 1-hour series at the time would have been shot in around 6 days, possibly 7.
We've got less than 2 hours to set the atomic trigger. Let's go.
Space 1999 was shot on 35mm film, at a time when most British series shot on film were using 16mm film stock, though in most cases television was usually recorded on videotape. Space 1999 was mainly shot on sound stages, whether it be Alpha's interiors or the moon's surface or alien vessels or some random planet. Location filming would take place on a few episodes, but even then those locations were close to the studios.
We'll believe anything you say, just get back to Alpha.
When it came time to make the second season, efforts were made to keep to a more rigid shooting schedule in order to make their intended air dates. Episodes still overran their shooting schedules, but a number of double-up scripts were written in a way so that half the cast could be shooting one episode on location, while another first-unit crew filmed a second episode back in the studio with the remainder of the cast. These double-up episodes weren't popular with the cast, particularly Martin Landau, but the 8 episodes made this way did help the second season keep more or less to its schedule.
We're certainly not going to find them by sitting on our butts here.
Making episodes this way is a bit like the aftermath of a kid's birthday party, where one of you cleans up all the vomit inside the house, while the other uses the power washer to clean up the vomit outside of the house. So splitting these tasks will have your house relatively vomit-free, just in time for Halloween.
Where do you think he was trying to get to out there in his pajamas?
For all of its positives, the first season does rely on several story elements that quickly became cliches or tropes. An eagle is thought lost, usually piloted by Alan, but he will make it home. But if he's not the pilot, the eagle will probably be destroyed. There's often some mysterious force that will remain mysterious. The Force may take over one or more Alphans to do their bidding. Somebody will have a vision of something that will come to pass, but they can't explain how or why they know, and of course no one else believes them. Sometimes there will be a major change or a massive crisis, which will all be magically reset by the end of the episode. Sometimes there's the idea that the Alphans have to do absolutely nothing to solve their impending crisis.
Please be more specific.
And on a few occasions, all of these tropes will combine to form a megatrope called Tropiconius.
Yes, interesting.
The viewer at home is a spectator for any show, but in Space 1999, the viewer is a spectator watching a bunch of other spectators.
And what must I do to help you achieve all of this?
Something mysterious is happening and then it all stops and everything's back to normal. The episodes often end with somebody staring out a window, looking at the stars, pondering an imponderable, so imponderable that there's nothing left to ponder.
I don't know. But I'll have a guess.
Of course, that part is highly disappointing, but in general, it's really enjoyable to watch. But I would hazard a guess, the first season is much more enjoyable to watch when you're older, and year 2 is better when you're younger. Like, much younger.
Keep talking, Granddad.
Space 1999 built up a world that was quite different from UFO. Space 1999 is on the whole a mainly optimistic series. Before the time the series was set, space exploration was at a stage where there were many manned space missions and probes to here, there and everywhere. Though as far as the show's internal continuity is concerned, almost every single one of them was thought to have met an unfortunate fate. Lost in this, destroyed in that, blown up, crushed beyond all recognition, gone through a space warp here. The wayward Earth Moon, though, does seem to have a remarkable aptitude for finding every single one of those lost expeditions. So, I don't know, maybe the Moon can take a butcher's to see if they can find Amelia Earhart.
I don't know what's happened. I know what hasn't happened.
As mentioned earlier, Gerry and Sylvia Anderson, with partner Reg Hill, had produced several popular children's series in the 1960s using their supermarionation process, which mixed marionette puppets and outstanding miniature special effects to create fast-moving action series. These shows were often full of mainly American-sounding characters and their daring adventures that were often accompanied by the absolute best special effects of any British television programs of their day. Under their AP Films banner, later Century 21, shows like Supercar, Fireball XL5, Stingray, Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet, Joe 90, Secret Service, became mostly oft-repeated classics where each would enchant a new generation of viewers. Though let's be honest, Thunderbirds was by far the most popular and well-known. But despite the Anderson shows being made with an eye on US sales, only Fireball XL5 ever managed the feat of a sale to a US network.
Let's go!
Lou Grade's company ITC made glossy programs in Britain with that same goal, and he quickly added the Andersons' company to his stable of program makers. Grade's programs sold worldwide, but the goal was a US network sale, which potentially would dwarf sales to the rest of the world combined. Hence, from the mid-60s, like the Anderson shows, Grade's programs often had an American actor as a lead in series such as The Baron, Man in a Suitcase, The Champions, and Department S. By 1970, the Andersons had put puppets behind them with their first live-action drama series, UFO. No, seriously, there's no puppets in this. UFO starred Ed Bishop as Commander Straker, head of Shadow, a secret organization set up to defend Earth against alien incursions. UFO was set 10 years in the future, where people drove futuristic cars while wearing Nehru jackets. While there was also Shadow's Moonbase operation, where the women wore purple wigs whilst on duty, as in it was part of their uniform. So the phrase regulation wig does seem a bit silly, but it does avoid a court-martial. UFO screened in the UK from 1970, but didn't make a massive impact in its home market thanks to haphazard scheduling by ITV companies in different regions.
You never touch it, do you?
When UFO was screened in the US as an off-network syndicated series in 1972, it had initially performed better in some key markets. So there was brief talk of ITC financing another series of episodes. Whereas previously, Gerry Anderson would pitch a series directly to Lou Grade and then leave the meeting with a verbal agreement, a handshake, and a lungful of cigar smoke, now there was a new player, ITC's New York sales office, led by its president, Abe Mandel. The New York office was there to handle American sales of ITC's output and advise the UK-based producers of what would and wouldn't work for American audiences. Mandel would be a new layer of abstraction between Anderson and Grade. Anderson would have to try and appease Mandel in a number of areas. When UFO screened in the US around 1972, ITC's New York office had research suggesting that episodes set on Moonbase had rated far better than Earthbound episodes. When being pitched a rebooted UFO, Abe Mandel resisted the central premise, fearing that once the show was up and running, Anderson would just set a bunch of episodes on Earth. Anderson's idea? Screw the Earth. Earth would blow up, sending the moon on its course through space. At the time, that was considered just a bit much, and instead the moon was blasted out of Earth orbit. Work on the series, that was called variously UFO 2 or UFO 1999, continued until those initially promising US ratings cooled. The Andersons finished up work on another series for ITC, The Protectors, starring Robert Vaughn, and then pivoted towards taking all of the work for UFO 1999 and turning that into a brand new spacefaring series, which we'll call, I don't know, Space 1999, and hopefully we can think of a better title later on. The entire first season of 24 episodes would be in the can before ITC began the process of trying to sell the show to potential buyers in the US. The cost for the first season of Space 1999, around £3.5 million, or at the time $6.5 million. Sir Lou Grade had negotiated a co-production deal with Italian broadcaster Rai, with the idea that several episodes would feature Italian guest stars.
Maybe in a while we'd get around to my sex life.
All right.
In the 1960s, ITC usually had an American actor in their shows, but by the early 70s, these shows would need actual stars rather than just actors with the right accent. So then we had shows starring Gene Barry, Tony Curtis, Shirley MacLaine, Robert Vaughn, and even in one pilot, Leonard Nimoy. For this new space series, they would likewise need bona fide stars. The search was on. So when you cast an expensive television show, you don't just look to see what's fallen behind the sofa cushions. You need big stars, names that will make people change the channel. And I mean change the channel to your show to see your star, not change the channel to get away from that bastard. Oh, him again.
His face is even more well-known than yours.
Who?
Martin Landau.
Never heard of him.
Martin Landau and Barbara Bain had left Mission Impossible after 3 seasons, where they would spend the early 70s doing various guest roles. The Andersons had initially wanted other actors for the main roles, perhaps somebody like Robert Culp, but Grade was adamant the series had to have bankable American stars, and the pair from Mission Impossible seemed like a good fit. Landau and Bain's agents drove a hard bargain during negotiations, but in general, the pair do a lot of the heavy lifting in making the show work. Barry Morse was cast as Gerry Anderson had enjoyed his turn in The Fugitive. The rest of the cast were usually British, with a couple of Italian guest stars as part of ITC's co-production deal with Italian broadcaster Rai, putting up half the money and all of the hand gestures.
At best, it's a calculated risk. But there's a chance.
ITC New York's Abe Mandel saw a few early episodes and told Anderson they needed monsters. People in America wanted monsters.
We could do it, sir, but only just.
Then, later in the season, when a few episodes with monsters had been filmed, Mandel complained to Anderson that monsters were now old hat. I totally sympathise. I fed my cat canned chicken for many years, since it seemed to like chicken the best. But now it's suddenly decided that it doesn't want chicken and only wants cans of tuna, since tuna is best. However, in this case, I had already bought 24 cans of chicken at a cost of £3.5 million, so I still feed the furry git canned chicken. There were other considerations when aiming to appeal to an American audience at the time. Cool it on the accents, baby. Space 1999 would have a mainly British cast, most of whom would speak with a relatively standard accent. It was considered that American viewers would have difficulty understanding regional British accents. To American ears, watching an episode of Coronation Street sounded like people slowly recovering from a serious car accident.
Help me!
History does not record whether the 1980s comedy drama Our Wiedersehen Pet was ever screened in the US, and if it was, whether it was subtitled or redubbed into English.
Gosh, I'm terribly sorry, old bean. I shan't be at the bar this evening as I'm running perilously low on funds. I shall only be able to reimburse you for that loan of £5 once Mummy and Daddy return from Provence.
Composer Barry Gray had provided almost all of the music for Anderson's series right back to their first puppet show in the 50s, and for Space 1999's first season, he would create a number of grand compositions that would be used throughout the first year. The limited budget for new music was augmented by occasionally reusing cues from Gray's work on previous Anderson series, and in some episodes there were cues from musical libraries. The theme to Space 1999's first year was a potent mix of a full orchestra playing alongside a funk rock band. It screams adventures in space.
Hey man, it's the 70s. Rock out with your cum lockout.
The title sequence for the first year would feature a short montage of action scenes from the episode you're about to watch, as well as a recap of the accident that blasted the moon out of Earth's orbit. Year 1 was written by a variety of writers, some Americans, though most of the scripts were written by writers based in Britain. Christopher Penfold, Edward De Lorenzo, and particularly Johnny Byrne wrote the bulk of scripts for the first season.
Alpha was freezing to death, and we were no nearer to understanding the force that held our moon, a static prisoner in space.
Space 1999 premiered in Britain in September of 1975, though like UFO, it did not secure a networked screening across ITV companies, instead screening in different regions on different days and different time slots. Apparently, ITV companies programmed their schedules by throwing darts at a clock.
Of course, that's just pure theory.
This was considered a valid strategy for years, but did no favours to some of the most expensive programs made in Britain.
Now, what do they want from us, really?
Space 1999 was almost but not quite sold to a US network, and instead was sold directly to individual stations, i.e. syndication, where it began screening in the fall of 1975. After production wrapped on the first season, writers began putting together script ideas for a second season. Gerry Anderson also worked on a pilot for another science fiction series known as Into Infinity in the UK, or The Day After Tomorrow in America. After the first series of 24 episodes ended production, there would be major changes to the show and how it was made. Gerry and Sylvia Anderson had finally called it quits on their relationship, which led to Sylvia Anderson's involvement with the series ending, then a damaging and protracted and incredibly acrimonious divorce. The first season of Space 1999 had rated relatively well in America, but ITC New York wasn't willing to finance a second season on its own.
And being constantly renewed.
Rather than plunge into production of a second season after the usual short break, it would be around 8 months before production on season 2 would begin.
A temporary delay. That's the best I can do.
In that time, there was a strong chance that the show would not continue. One of ITC's stipulations that the show would need an American head writer, and so Gerry Anderson went off to the US to talk to prospective candidates. The leading candidate was Freiberger, who'd worked on Wild Wild West. He seemed to have written at least one episode for almost every series on the air, both primetime and Saturday morning. He'd recently created his own Saturday morning series for Hanna-Barbera, Korg 70,000 BC.
His brain is gone.
Of course, in the late 60s, Freiberger had been hired as the producer on the final season of Star Trek, after it was already abundantly clear that that show was on borrowed time as far as both the network and studio were concerned.
You were going to be scrapped, weren't you?
That final season was considered, in almost every way, to be inferior to the show's first 2 seasons, with Freiberger as producer rightfully copping a lot of the blame. Apparently, spending time in a POW camp in Germany during World War II was a picnic compared to dealing with overwrought Star Trek fans. Even then, Anderson felt he could work with Freiberger. Also, he was available and willing to relocate to the UK.
Brain and brain! What is brain?
Gerry Anderson had at first hired Freiberger as the head writer, but later decided to let him produce the series, thinking that if he made a go of the series, then that was great, and if he didn't, then Fred Freiberger could take the blame. Johnny Byrne, who would end up writing more episodes of the series than anyone else and had worked on both versions of the show, understood that without Freiberger, there most likely would have been no second season. Also, while fans may hate the fella, he was mostly well liked as a person by those who worked with him, even by those who disagreed vehemently with his creative decisions. I mean, as for those creative decisions, like a head lice outbreak, there are a few head scratches.
What if it didn't have to be that way?
After viewing 8 episodes of the first season, Freiberger had interpreted his job brief as one where he had to fix a broken series. He thought plots needed to be pacier and less obscure, less impenetrable, and with clear explanations. Also, the main characters really needed to lighten up and not be so closed off. While ITC promoted the second season as having a larger budget, the reality was the show would need to be made much more efficiently, especially as ITC didn't have the co-production deal with Rai anymore.
Stand by for takeoff!
Year 2 had more monsters, I mean a lot more monsters. But there'd also be strange areas of space that would affect the crew in weird ways. A few episodes where a crew member's obsession or mental health was intertwined with whatever the crisis of the week was. Alpha was still uncontrollable and threatening to crash into any number of planets.
The explosions were traveling one way only, outward.
Right.
In several episodes, Alpha's life support systems desperately needed a metal for this, or on a different week needed a totally different metal, or some aliens wanted to steal the whole damn thing. Or they wanted to drain Alpha of its energy, or its people of their minds, or whatever. However, Year 2, for all of its many faults, does tend to feel a bit more human. There are more actual villains in episodes, people with motivations as to why they are behaving villainously. Of course, there are still a few episodes with spurious setups, so the main characters can fight monsters for 50 minutes. For all of the insistence of being different from Year 1, the second series would just have its own tropes, all staying at the casino hotel, the Tropicana.
I'm afraid I'm right, whether intentionally or not.
Alpha's massive main mission set would be replaced by a smaller underground command centre, and there would just be a faster-paced action-adventure vibe to the series, without the mysterious unknown force influencing the lives of Alphans. Gerry Anderson stood back from the writing process to the point where Fred Freiberger was now in firm command of the series. Year 2 would have a wider base of writers, many of whom had worked on various ITC series, as well as a couple of writers who'd write for Doctor Who. Year 2 producer Fred Freiberger also wrote 3 episodes, for cost reasons, where he used a pen name, Charles Woodgrove. The directors were mainly British, including many veterans of the British film industry, such as Charles Crichton, who would go on to direct more episodes of the series than anyone else. The second season would keep on many of the same production personnel, directors, and some of the writers. The cast, however, was a different story. Freiberger had initially wanted to get rid of everybody apart from Landau and Bain. He first took aim at Victor, saying he wanted a younger cast in general. At first, Barry Morse was made offers to continue, but for a significantly reduced salary.
Take your choice.
Barry Morse decided to accept the new deal, but by then Freiberger's mind had been made up.
So, that's it.
Alan Carter was also in the firing line, but eventually the character's popularity meant Nick Tate would appear in most episodes. Zienia Merton and Anton Phillips would return, but not as regulars, and instead they would be hired on an episode-by-episode basis. Phillips stayed for 2 episodes before Dr. Matthias's role was taken on by multiple different characters. Sandra returned for some episodes, replaced by other characters in more or less the same role in other installments. Characters such as Yasko and Delebe, who had so much thought put into them that the characters just inherited the actors' names. When Zienia Merton did return, her character was renamed as San, simply because Fred Freiberger said so. Yes, technically it sounds like changing your name on a small community like Moonbase Alpha. It doesn't sound like it would have the same sort of headaches as it would on Earth, where you have to change your driver's license, passports, credit cards, etc. But still, on Alpha, you're probably okay, since you really only need your comlock and its password changed. Getting that changed shouldn't be an issue, so long as nothing happens to technician Bill Bill was the only one who knew the password to the machine that changes the passwords. Pilot Bill Fraser appeared in a number of episodes as another character to plug in the gaps when they needed a character who was semi-familiar to the audience.
Well, if this works, maybe I won't have to take any more chances.
Tony Vedeschi was Moonbase Alpha's security chief. He's Italian, though he has a British accent. And he's Koenig's second-in-command. Basically the exact same role as Paul Morrow, but far more involved in the plots. Tony Anholt had appeared in the Andersons' earlier series, The Protectors. Vedeschi never really gets much of an introduction, he's just there in the first episode of Year 2, but slowly, bit by bit, we learn a little bit more. Tony would be a much bigger player in the series, where he'll basically play the lead role in several episodes when Koenig was not around. Tony's relatively level-headed as Alpha's second-in-command, though he has a side hustle trying to brew his own beer on Moonbase Alpha.
On your scale of 1 to 10, where are you now?
Tony's microbrew seems to be 1 part paint stripper, 2 parts paint stripper, 1 more part paint stripper.
Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give it 6 for potency and 3 for flavour.
What it lacks in appearance and taste, it makes up for its abilities to clean paintbrushes. Thankfully, he seems to have reversed engineered the recipe for Foster's. And just as we ran out of character traits for Tony, his mama back in Italy cooks lots of pasta. The other new character was the shape-changing alien specifically created by Freiberger to fill in a void caused by the fact that there was no shape-changing character. Maya was from the planet Psychon when she came to the sad realization that her megalomaniac father was in fact a megalomaniac, trying to suck the brains out of the Alphans, which some would say was Fred Freiberger's job.
One of us is wrong.
Maya knew more about the universe and would become Alpha's scientific advisor.
The memories aren't sad. Except at the end.
Maya would also have to contend with Tony's affections before the pair were sort of coupled up most of the time.
Just because you look funny, come from the planet Psychon, and turn into an eel the last time I put my arms around you?
Catherine Schell had appeared with Barry Morse in an earlier ITC series, The Adventurer. She'd already appeared as a Bond girl in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, starred in a Lou Grade-produced Return of the Pink Panther film, and guested on Space 1999 as a different character in Year 1. Maya could change form at will into almost anything, like a T-1000, but we're pretty sure she's not a Terminator. 90%. 80%, it's a coin toss. Maya's shape-shifting will be used for many things in Space 1999. She can transform into a bird to reconnoiter a situation, she can turn into a monster when she needs extra strength, or turn into an alien form that, say, doesn't need to breathe oxygen. Also, and this is very important, please do not underestimate the importance of cheap gags. So Maya will double Helena to screw with John Koenig.
You mean you can't tell?
Well, of course I can tell.
Or make herself unappealing to ward off the gaggle of chameleoid fetishists in this galaxy. Maya is often, but not always, a get-out-of-jail-free card for writers. So sometimes they will put limits on her powers, so those powers are not as overpowering as they could be. Early episodes use her abilities rather sparingly, but later on, well, how do we get out of this situation? Okay, Maya will turn into a kendo master. Some involved with the series were initially not sure about bringing in Maya, worrying the character could become a gimmick. Barbara Bain had other concerns, with Maya limited from ever appearing as a purely humanoid character, basically as Catherine Schell without the alien makeup. The Maya makeup evolved in early episodes, with the dark shading of her ears in early episodes changed, since it did look like she had missed a spot in the shower. Maya quickly found a soulmate of sorts in Tony Vedeschi. The pair care for each other, but as it's a family show, their relationship in many episodes seems one more of longing than much action.
Maya, I love you.
Oh, but man, the fan fiction. I think I'm gonna need some water here.
Well, he had a nice way of speaking, unlike some people I know.
So after a major clean-out of the cast and an introduction of 2 new cast members, there were more basic changes to the show's presentation. The standard Moon City uniforms were looking a bit too 1970s, nearly all beige and flared trousers and a giant zip, so they were fixed by adding turtlenecks and jackets with wide collars. Yeah, that's much better, far less 70s looking. There were minor tweaks to the beige part of the uniform with striping and patches and name tags added. Also, the uniforms had more patches on them than the coat rack at a high school teacher's lounge.
Now, I don't have anything specifically in mind. I'm open to anything.
Some of the women wore skirts and boots, but there were lots of different types of jackets. Some episodes have every character wearing a different type of jacket in the same scene. So either they were previously in storage, or Alpha just went through a phase where everybody got a sewing machine for Christmas. Perhaps at some point, the moon rumbled past a planet where they did nothing but make jackets. Koenig has a number of jackets. There's a short-lived cardigan with a giant collar, which made way for the standard jacket on Alpha, and a unique red jacket when on missions. I don't know, maybe Koenig wanted to pretend to be Steve Austin. Barry Gray did not return for the second series for personal reasons, with the first season of Space 1999 being his final work on a TV project. British trombone player and composer Derek Wadsworth was brought in, and his score is, well, it's okay, it's just different. The music is definitely more intimate, it's jazzier, rockier, definitely more up-tempo in the action scenes. And there's also the lousy cocktail bar electric piano and synthesizer music playing over the comedy scenes and tags, which were intended to humanise the main characters. You know, those scenes that end on a freeze frame of the characters sharing a laugh. I'm a huge fan of Barry Gray, but the less epic sound and faster pace of the music in Year 2 suits the less epic and more action-packed nature of the stories. By less epic, I mean it's obvious to a trained ear that a lot of the music is played by a smaller number of musicians than you would have heard in the music from the first year. Like Year 1, there was a limited amount of music recorded for the series that would be recycled throughout all 24 episodes of Year 2. With the changes came a new opening title sequence, though this was identical for every episode. A planned voiceover by Koenig over the animated sequence detailing the series premise went unused, and instead we'll listen to Wadsworth's energetic Year 2 theme. Year 2 started off with episodes that felt similar to those in the first year, just with the superficial changes in presentation in the cast.
Commander.
What are you doing?
Though it would not be long before you could tell the changes went deeper than that. Year 2 stories were generally faster paced, with a lot more action And monsters. I mean, a lot of monsters. Mostly gone were random alien influences coming to Alpha, doing something without context, and then floating off. There was no more Victor speculating on what may have happened, and in most episodes we'll have definite answers as to what was going on. People smiled more. A lot more. Unfortunately, that included Martin Landau. Characters disappeared, replaced by new characters in the exact same role, and we had new faces in the form of Tony Vedeschi and Maya. It's never explicitly explained why certain crew members disappeared in between seasons, though I believe there is a clue in the opening titles to Year 2. No, John, no! Year 2 stories occasionally recalled the mystery of the first season, but more often than not, plots were usually much more straightforward for the audience at home, whether they were slack-jawed or if their jaw arrangement was somewhat tighter. If you had to pick one word to describe Year 2, it would be American. Now that's not used as a pejorative, it's just what Year 2 producer Fred Freiberger had set out to do, make the show appeal to Americans used to series like Star Trek and Lost in Space.
Texas City is one of several metropolitan complexes.
More action, more battles, more fights, more people wearing skimpy outfits.
There's terrible danger in there.
And much more warmth emanating from the main characters, which is manifest by a general romantic air and people joking around. Koenig seems much more relaxed, Helena is also much less businesslike and a lot friendlier.
Bang, bang, you're dead.
After so long in space, the command structure is there, but by now Alan and Tony often address John Koenig by his first name.
Murderer! You have had your last communication with Alpha.
On one planet, sentient vegetation pits Koenig and Maya up against three monsters. Someone claiming to be God wants to plonk Koenig, Maya, Tony and Helena on a planet with the idea of them breeding, but not in their usual pairings. There's also an episode about a sentient rock, an episode about a sentient robot, episodes about sentient energy, more sentient robots, a lot of sentience on screen. You know, sentience, able to feel, which ironically means there wasn't so much sentience behind the scenes. Year 2, with its even greater focus on appealing to an American audience, does develop a kind of a split personality in some ways. There are only a few American or American-sounding guest stars, but a fair few random Alphans now sound vaguely American. There are the little things like Command Center being spelt the American way on signs, but uses the British spelling on things like name badges. When people talk about food or drink, it's always coffee or hamburgers. It's never tea or baked beans on toast. Though, realistically, I can totally understand why baked beans would be banned on Moonbase Alpha, with the danger of explosive decompression just too great to ignore. The highlights of Year 2, the season opener, the Metamorph which introduced Maya, Seed of Destruction with a duplicate John Koenig, and my favourite, the two-parter Bringers of Wonder.
What's the matter, John?
As for lowlights, well, we will be taking a detailed look at individual episodes in another video.
An acronym can only kill!
Space 1999, in general, managed to keep its continuity straight in its head, at least for the first season. There are some flashbacks that come perilously close to breaking that continuity, but in general, the first 24 episodes tend not to overly contradict each other.
Well, it seems all right.
So far.
Season 2 is another matter entirely. Even if you overlook the cast changes that were generally ignored on screen, or the slight changes to presentation, it's little things like the dates of how long they've been wandering in space.
It was the 877th day since our moon left Earth.
In a few Year 1 episodes, they will make mention of how long they've been in space. It's already been implied to be a year or more in some episodes.
342 days, 1,196 days, 1,288 days, 2,009 days since leaving Earth orbit.
The second season resets the clock, with Helena's status updates at the start of many episodes, starting Year 2 at around a year after the moon broke out of Earth's orbit. Technology fluctuates, as does Earth's history. There was now a previously unmentioned war on Earth taking place just over a decade before the show was set, a war in which Koenig lost his previously unmentioned wife. Somewhat disturbingly, the number of Alphans who died during the show's run is not at all tracked well. Whenever we're given the number of Alphans, it's always at or near 300, despite 40 to 45 Alphans shown to have died throughout the series, plus the few who left Alpha. The death toll doesn't include those who magically returned to life at the end of the episode, or those who magically disappeared in between seasons. Maya, of course, joins the crew, and one birth is ever mentioned. Later on, the life support situation is so precariously balanced that Alpha can't permit new births. The way this is achieved is never mentioned, so perhaps the poorly fitting uniforms also have an unintended side effect of greatly suppressing the libido. Anytime we were shown a new Alphan in a major role, the chances of them making it through to the end of the episode and still requiring oxygen to survive was limited. What's the explanation for all of this? Was Earth's space program in the late 90s so desperate for staff that any prerequisites for mathematics were waived? Or, and this does seem more likely, it was a TV show.
There's no rational explanation. It could happen to any one of us.
These inconsistencies are mainly very small things. How much of that you just accept is down to how much you care about Space 1999 and what level of pedant you are. I personally am a level 3 pedant master, which is, I will generally accept stuff since it's an old episodic television show made decades ago and radically retooled by a new producer, but as a level 3 pedant master, every time you write should of, I will be summoning ninjas.
We're still in the game.
Right on.
Space 1999 ended when ITC had decided fairly on, during the broadcasts of Year 2, that they would not be funding another series. Ratings in the US were not what they needed to be, and in the UK, that ITV scheduling dartboard seems to be the only analogue clock that wasn't even correct twice a day.
Nothing wrong with that equipment.
Without a broadcaster footing the bill, Space 1999 wasn't cancelled in the traditional way as the original Star Trek had been cancelled. ITC had done the sums and decided not to continue, while they were generally scaling back on bankroll the glossy television series like Space 1999 and Return of the Saint. Instead, they would plunge into producing feature films, with Plunged also describing the results.
So much for your fancy theories of cosmic intelligence.
The cast were told there'd be no third season around October of 1976, since there was absolutely no reason to assume that any broadcasters would be interested in any sort of science fiction series in late 1977. Nope, not at all.
I have a bad feeling.
People were just so over science fiction, particularly if it was set in space.
Dove andate?
Andrò a controllare io stesso l'area di eliminazione nucleare.
Sì, signore.
Space 1999 debuted first as a feature film released in Italian cinemas. Spazio 1999 combined several episodes dubbed into Italian, funnily enough, though none of the donor episodes featured any of the Italian guest stars. After the show ended, ITC put together a number of compilation television movies for theatrical release outside the US. The series' only two-part story, Bringers of Wonder from Year 2, was the first to receive this treatment. With a few snips and a new narration, it became the first standalone movie released theatrically in Europe in 1978, as Destination Moonbase Alpha.
The date time is now well into the 21st century.
Alien Attack soon followed in 1979, which combined first season episodes Breakaway and War Games into a movie with some additional footage filmed in what looks like the boardroom of a company that sold used audiovisual equipment to high schools.
No visuals? Sound only.
These were also sold to television companies for broadcast in the US and were later released on home video. Two more compilation movies were added, Journey Through the Black Sun, which combined a pair of first season episodes, and Cosmic Princess, which joined together two episodes from the second season. For a while, these compilations would have been the most accessible ways to see parts of the series. I do recall renting Destination Moonbase Alpha in the mid-80s and later saw all four television movies screened on a Saturday afternoon, which was curious because Alien Attack used a piece of library music for its opening title sequence, which on another channel was being used as the theme for the local version of Wide World of Sports. There was quite a bit of merchandise available during the show's run, with books, audio adventures with a different cast, toys, figures, puzzles, but without new weekly episodes, the series would slowly fade away from the general public consciousness, apart from random screenings of those compilation movies. I have very vague memories of watching the show when I was young, but by then it was possibly the second or third repeat screening. Years later in the 1990s, it was screened locally early in the morning at a time when I was working shift work, so I'd tape Space 1999 and watch it back after work. I never had to put cheese on my cheese sandwich, there was enough of that on screen. But the show did have its fans, and still does decades later, where Space 1999 merchandise is still being produced. Models and kits of various Eagles, the stun gun and the Comlock. There are new audio adventures, you can buy the costumes and various figurines. After Space 1999 wrapped, Martin Landau and Barbara Bain would eventually separate. Their daughter Juliet became an actress with the regular role as Drusilla on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Both Bain and Landau continued their acting careers. Landau's in particular would become stuck in a rut until he began gaining notice for supporting roles in the late 80s, where he eventually won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role as Bela Lugosi in Ed Wood. Most of the cast of Space 1999 would work widely. Tony Anholt starred in various series. Catherine Schell would later appear in a Doctor Who, before eventually retiring from acting, though she would later appear in a Dracula series released in 2020. Nick Tate worked on a bit of everything in Australia, the US and the UK, but we can't go past Coolangatta Gold. Barry Morse would appear in lots of things like The Shape of Things to Come, Martian Chronicles, and the much-loved, by me, Whoops Apocalypse. A Space 1999 fan film message from Moonbase Alpha brought back Zienia Merton to record a message to attempt to wrap up the series' many loose ends. Gerry and Sylvia Anderson, having gone their separate ways, each tried to launch their own projects. Gerry Anderson would eventually put together a new puppet series, Terrorhawks, in the 1980s, and afterwards tried to get together funding for a new live-action science fiction series, Space Police. After making a pilot in the late 80s, that the concept finally became a reality when it was turned into the show Space Precinct in the 1990s. Lou Grade, then Sir Lou Grade, and then Baron Grade would scale back his involvement in expensive television series, though he did put up funding for The Muppet Show. He made a move into big-budget miniseries with Jesus of Nazareth, which was a huge success, but Grade's moves into motion picture production were less successful, particularly box office failures like Saturn III and Raise the Titanic. Ironically, a financial disaster based on a real disaster. But his company also produced Hawk the Slayer as a cheapie, so there's form. Space 1999 as a series is interesting in that it tries very hard to do something a little different in its first year, and in its second year tried very hard to do what it thought American audiences wanted.
Hope that we can do it in time.
I find my relationship with the show changes whenever I get the urge to rewatch it every decade or so. So I found I vastly enjoyed the first season, complete with its ponderous and po-faced episodes this time around. It sometimes does feel cold and aloof, but many times has an almost there energy. The second season is also enjoyable, but in a completely different way. Sometimes it has some interesting ideas, but there's also a lot of very naff story premises that feel like they were using sonar to explore the bottom of the barrel. Its faster pace is welcome, and the suddenly warmer characters has pros and cons. Helena is less of a pill, John Koenig just feels a bit creepier. Tony and Maya generally work well as characters and have been given a lot more to do than most of Year One's supporting characters. Even if Maya was loaded with a gimmick that kept on gimmicking.
Not so crazy after all.
If you like space adventures, particularly a 70s style space adventure, then this is the series you should look at. It's oh so dated, with a very quaint prediction of how 1999 would look, but it is less 56K and more Casey and the Sunshine Band. Landau and Bain are very strong leads in a series that was the closest thing to a new weekly Star Trek-style space adventure series in that decade.
We had a little help, Tony.
From a friend.
Space 1999, for all its goofiness, often punches above its weight, particularly in its first year, where it carves its own unique path. The second year, that aimed to be more accessible, may have diluted the basic idea, but it's still a fun watch. Ah, damn it, I've gone and bought some more toys. We have not gone too deeply into many of the individual episodes, because we'll be back in part 2 at some point, where we will look at each individual episode in slightly more detail. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.